Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and we are back with another Future of the Vampire Counts video. This is part 2, or the suggested free LC for the Vampire Count section. So as just a reminder, this section is dedicated to adding or modifying content that would require more than simple tweaks or stat changes, but would not require brand new assets or extremely in-depth work. The first thing I want to touch on is finishing my suggestion train on moving the secondary legendary lord from each of the base races to a new location. Much like Ungrim and Azhag, Heinrich Kimmler is quite out of place in the original faction starting zone of Sylvania. Kimmler's stomping grounds featured almost exclusively around the Grey Mountains for most of his long life, which allowed him to be quite the mobile threat. From here, he would often strike out at nearby lands to claim some artifact or plunder a notable graveyard for powerful servants. Over the years, he's attacked Athel Loren, the Empire, and of course his most hated enemies in the land of Bretonnia. For his location, I would recommend moving Kimmler over to Musion to assist in the war against Bretonnia over there. Alternatively, he could be placed in a new settlement made to be his home base in the mountains, which honestly could go just about anywhere, but that may be way too much work. I do know a fair amount of people have pointed to Kimmler's habit of being a bit of a wanderer and say that this should make him into a horde army, but honestly I don't think that fits him as well as most of you believe. Although it's true he's a tad nomadic, Heinrich actually does establish bases of operations when he conquers an area, and like most necromancers, requires time and planning to get things truly up and running. We see this most notably in the Gotrek and Felix novel, Zombie Slayer, where the dynamic duo have to face the Lichmaster and he ends up conquering a massive empire fortress as his base for most of the book. But yeah, that's pretty much it for old Kimmler. Moving on. As we discussed in the Future of the Greenskins video, I would really like to see swarms implemented into the game like how CA did with tomb swarms, reimagining them as abilities or skills instead of full-blown units. So, for the vampire counts, we'll be looking at the annoying bat swarms. Like when I talked about while we were discussing snotlings, all swarms in 8th edition Warhammer Tabletop had a unique ability or gimmick that made them stand out. For the bat swarms, it was an ability called Cloud of Horror. This skill made it so that anyone in combat with the flying rodents would immediately suffer from Always Strike Last, as they flailed around wildly trying to protect themselves from countless bites and scratches. For Total War Warhammer, I would definitely make these guys into an ability, as an actual bat swarm would really struggle to be any different from their larger cousins, the Fell Bats. I think the most interesting way to implement Cloud of Horror would be for it to be a unique ability to one of the currently less useful characters like the Master Necromancer or Vampire Hero. Regardless of who has it, the ability should be a single target or AoE ability that when used reduces the melee attack of the affected target. This could also be an army ability instead, but that might be more difficult to implement and it would work just fine on a character. Another idea could be the Cloud of Horror only does a small debuff on the enemy target, but perhaps inflicts a small amount of damage alongside, like a slightly better basic Flock of Doom, so not the Overcast version, the regular one. One other thing I've been thinking about is it might be nice to see if the various types of corruption could be made slightly more interesting somehow. When looking at vampiric corruption, for instance, it might be nice if once it reaches, say, 85% or higher, the constant darkness, creeping mist, and stormy skies cause a debuff to accuracy and leadership for those armies fighting in such terrible climates, excepting the vampires, of course. If it were to have notable stat effects, they would definitely need to be restricted to only the highest levels of corruption, and perhaps if the VC fight in a location with 10% or less corruption, they take a penalty to leadership and winds of magic to represent not having much of a power base. I'm kinda spitballing this one, but I'd really like to see the effects of corruption be expanded just beyond public order and attrition. In fact, in yesterday's video, I saw someone suggest in the comment section, what if corruption was tied to the Raise Dead mechanic as well? For instance, you could only summon certain tiers of undead depending on your corruption level, which once again kind of ties in with the tiers I was talking about. For things in the game that have meters, like the WA meter or corruption mechanics, I really hope we can push the idea that it would be really nice to see these actually have tangible effects along the spectrum instead of just at the smallest and highest levels. For the free LC Legendary Lord to join the undead ranks, we have the very easy option of the Red Duke. He is easily one of the most tragic characters in Warhammer, and a strong warning to all about the horrors of vampirism. Once the greatest swordsman in Bretonnia, he was struck down by a poisoned dagger in the final stages of the war against Sultan Jafar in the Crusades. Paralyzed and mortally wounded by cowardly assassins, his assailants were butchered by the legendary vampire Aberash. First of the Blood Dragon line, the most martially skilled vampire refused to allow such a powerful hero of the Bretonnie to die in such a fashion, as he held much respect for them to the extent he had sworn some secret oath in fealty to Gilles le Breton, founder of Bretonnia. From there, the Red Duke slowly turned as his wounded form was taken back to Bretonnia, but suffered ambush after ambush by Arabians, Skaven, Greenskins, and even his own men. Yet, he survived, and his transformation took months as the Red Duke refused to give in to bloodlust and this curse running through his veins. Sadly, fate would strike against him, as he returned home to discover his beloved wife had committed suicide after hearing he had fallen, and while begging silently for death, he overheard one of his knights admit their betrayal. This, along with the curse of vampirism, shoved him over the edge and his resolve caved. Thus was born the Red Duke, who in his madness thought those who loved him truly had betrayed him. So he fought a horrible war against the land he loved in life, until the climactic battle at Seren Field against King Louis the Righteous, his younger brother. The Grail Knight turned king slew his closest friend and older sibling in a duel beyond famous, and such was his grief in doing so. Thus he ordered the Red Duke's horrible legacy be struck from all records, and a tomb erected to remind all of his heroism before those dark years. Yet the prophetess at the time, Isabu, knew the world needed to forget the Duke, lest some necromancer try to restore him, as the king had refused to burn the body. So she sealed his tomb with powerful enchantments, and after King Louis passed, personally ensured every record of the Red Duke's name and mortal life were destroyed. The only surviving element of his past was a missed marker on his tombstone that simply read El Sif. He would return 500 years later to war against his homeland once more, and nearly succeeded until he learned an earth-shattering truth that finally shook him from his madness, and a truly gut-wrenching reveal. I'll save that for his eventual lore video, however. Obviously, the Red Duke already has a unique faction, starting location, unique structure, and even his own amazing El Sif ability. The most obvious thing the Red Duke is lacking are his two magical items. Like most special characters, he wields both an offensive and defensive item, so let's just hop right into his fabled blade, the Sword of Leaping Gold. As the name implies, this dazzling weapon is a beautiful creation by the smiths of Araby that was enchanted to be quite powerful and lightning fast. Originally wielded by an emir during the Crusades, the Red Duke defeated the Southern Lord in single combat and claimed the sword as his prize. Bolstering his already horrific strength and speed as both a legendary Bretonnian warrior and a vampire of the Blood Dragon line, the Sword of Leaping Gold takes his combat prowess from amazing to just absurd. Funny enough, this weapon would end up being a part of the High Elves equipment section as the Red Duke faded into obscurity in the more modern lore, but it has been confirmed to still be a part of his kit, so apparently there are two Swords of Leaping Gold that are very similar, one forged by Araby and the other by the High Elves. If CA desired to give him a quest battle, the Sword of Leaping Gold would be the most appropriate in my opinion, especially if his quest was him fighting yet another legendary conflict at Saren Field, with hopefully the third time being the charm. As for effects, it should probably just be an ability that grants him a notable increase to melee attack and weapon strength. If CA wanted to make things interesting, perhaps it could increase his actual attack animation a hair, as in make it faster? I don't know if that's actually doable though, or if it would just be hilariously overpowered. As for his other item, the Red Duke gains his iconic title due to his red plate armor known as the Armor of Blood. Infused with dark magic by all the horrible atrocities and massacres he has committed, the Armor of Blood seems to have the ability to absorb any gore spilt upon it. This results in the Red Duke's wounds regenerating at an alarming pace, as if he were drinking from a fresh victim. Scarily, this grants him the best known healing among the vampires, so long as he's fighting in combat. It's literally just the hunger, but overcharged to an insane degree. Even Vlad von Karstein's legendary sword Blood Drinker isn't as effective as the Armor of Blood. For this item, it's fairly obvious. The ability would be to just add a powerful regenerative effect only when he's in close combat, so just a boosted version of the hunger, though in campaign it'd obviously grant him additional armor and other such bonuses. The last thing I'd like to talk about in the equipment section is that the Red Duke currently has a nice roster of mounts, and I hate to be that guy, but I would like it if he was made to exclusively having his legendary mount El Morzillo, which I probably pronounced that wrong, so forgive me. For those unaware, this name apparently belonged to a significant horse in our world's history that Cortez himself rode during his legendary invasion of the New World, and has become somewhat of a deity in some part of the world, at least he was for a while. In Warhammer, El Morzillo was a loyal steed of the Red Duke, and is actually rather unique for a Barded Nightmare, as it's a specter of shadows and dark flame instead of a horse's corpse. In life, it served the Red Duke faithfully in Araby until slain, but El Morzillo's spirit returned to serve at his call in Undeath. It's a massive Barded Nightmare, easily the largest and strongest of its kind as it had been in life. I wouldn't be too bothered if the Red Duke kept his expanded mount roster, but personally I think it'd be more fitting for him to have El Morzillo as his ultimate option. At the very least, I hope they'll change his Nightmare option to have the name El Morzillo and maybe make it more powerful, much like how they eventually gave Balthazar Gelt's Pegasus its name of Quicksilver quite a ways after Game 1 released. For abilities, I don't think the Red Duke needs anything added. El Sif is a really powerful ability. The Red Duke is also a pretty dang powerful caster. He's not Loremaster status though, so just keeping him with his current magical abilities seems fine to me. As for his effects in campaign, I would suggest the following brainstorm ideas. For the faction effects for Musion, I would recommend the following. Severe diplomacy debuff with all other Bretonnian factions. The next thing is a significant diplomacy bonus to other Bretonnian enemies or blood dragons, like Kimmler, who absolutely despises the Bretonnians and would likely side with anyone against them, or the Vampire Coast if they ever bring out Luther Harkin, as he's one of the 3 second-generation blood dragons. The other 2, of course, being Wallach Harkin, the legendary Lord of Blood Keep, who we don't know where he is these days, and of course the Red Duke himself. The final thing that I would add for Musion is for them to have increased recruitment rank and lower upkeep for both Blood Knights and Black Knights, as they're essentially just the undead Bretonnian faction. Looking over at Lord effects, I would suggest the following things for the Red Duke himself. He should gain a leadership bonus for his army when fighting against Bretonnian factions. I would also recommend maybe some minor stat boost to the Banshees and White Kings in his army to represent his famed lieutenants. And for a starting hero for his campaign, giving him Raynar the Necromancer would be fun. For those of you who don't know, Raynar the Necromancer was the poor fortuned individual who set him free in his novel The Red Duke, which I would highly recommend. As for final notes, the Red Duke should honestly be the absolute best vampire in close combat, with only the exception of Vlad's tankiness, or if they ever add Luther or Wallach Harkon to the game. Like the Harkons, the Red Duke is a second-generation blood dragon, or a first-generation descendant of Aberash, which makes him incredibly powerful. Unlike his two brothers in death, however, the Red Duke is actually a noted caster of some great ability, and is much more gifted in that vein. So whereas I would strongly push for all Blood Dragon characters and Legendary Lords to have notably worse casting abilities, the Red Duke is an exception to this rule. The final thing, which I will put in the free LC section because I would expect them to just kind of be a reskin or slightly interesting looking, would be that if you're going to make the Red Duke playable, it'd be nice to go ahead and toss him a new unit, being the Knights of the Black Grail, which are of course a very famous, they're basically just super elite vampire cav. So if you have the Blood Knights, the tier above them is the Knights of the Black Grail. Alright, time to move on to the final part of the FLC suggestions, which is of course, new unique structures. Thankfully, the vampire accounts already have a fairly solid number for their race, scattered around the world. The first new structure I would recommend is located in the Grey Mountains, just south of Axbite Pass, so it should either be placed in Karak Azgraz or Karak Norn. This is, of course, where the ruins of the legendary Castle Drakenfels stand. Featured recently in the Warhammer game Vermintide, Drakenfels is a foul place that was quite famous in the older Warhammer lore when Drakenfels himself was the main antagonist of a book series. It has been quite some time since the Great Enchanter's death, but his home remains a wicked and cursed place steeped in dark magic. Before I get into the details on this structure, I do want to make a note that some who may have read the original saga may pop out and say that Drakenfels was not technically an undead or necromancer, and while this is true, he has been transformed into a Vampire Counts character by Games Workshop during the events of the End Times, and some other rebranding that they've done for him. So if he's going to have a cameo, the Vampire Counts are the best fit for the job. Castle Drakenfels should provide the player with a notable increase in recruitment rank for necromancers globally, as Drakenfels himself was a notably powerful one, or at least he was gifted at necromancy. In addition, it should heavily increase vampiric corruption in the province. If possible, I would also recommend it add a bonus to starting winds of magic, either locally or globally, as the player unleashes the powerful artifacts found within. Far to the west, down in Lustria, there's an infamous region known as the Vampire Coast. This is the only notable vampire stronghold in the Western Hemisphere, and I was actually quite surprised to learn that none of the settlements in the Vampire Coast province have a unique structure to reward you for taking it. Thus, I would highly recommend placing a new unique building in the Awakening settlement. It should probably be an upgraded version of the port structure, much like we see in Marienburg. It should probably provide notable increase to dark magic in the area, as it is insanely saturated with death magic. In addition, I would suggest it increase local vampiric corruption a buttload to help counter those who seek to attack the area, like the pesky lizardmen, high elves, and of course the Skaven. Alternatively, it could have a unique structure called something along the lines of the Vampire Admiral's Horde that could provide a substantial global buff to zombies in some way, as the traditional Vampire Coast roster was literally just legions of different types of zombies. Next on the list is much closer to home for the von Karsteins. The capital of Eastern Sylvania is the Dark Castle of Tempelhof, which carries an ill tale that makes for a fun, unique structure. For this place, the nearby town of Tempelhof is named for an infamous temple of Mor, as despite its grandeur, has remained completely abandoned for over 800 years. The Midnight aristocracy do not take kindly to the priests of the god of death, and thus any who have tried to reopen the temple have mysteriously vanished only to turn up as drained corpses, if at all. To represent this legacy, I would suggest the Forsaken Temple, or Forsaken Temple of Mor, if that's not too many characters. For attributes, the Forsaken Temple should increase vampiric corruption in all adjacent provinces, and perhaps grant a recruitment rank or upkeep bonus to the likes of corpse carts and mortis engines, as they have free reign in the sacrilege of Mor's fallen temple. Moving a little over to the east, did you know that Waldenhof is actually the capital of Sylvania? It's a gloomy place built from dark stone and with terrifying gargoyles on seemingly every corner of the many peaked roofs. There's an unsettling gloom about the town that gives the feeling of always being watched by something hungry. For Waldenhof, I would recommend adding the Count's hunting grounds, as the ends of Waldenhof are actually the primary prowling grounds for many of the lesser von Karstein vampires. Here, they search eagerly for fresh prey, as travelers hope to follow the river from here into the Empire, or venture further east across the World's Edge Mountains. For effect, I would simply have this structure increase growth, and perhaps grant a +1 or 2 ranks to starting vampire heroes globally or locally. The last one I'll be looking at is the horrifying legacy bound to Fort Oberstyre. Once it was the pride of Stirland's military might, as it was constructed after Vlad von Karstein's death to serve as a bulwark against any further legions of undead. It took 23 years to build, and became the absolute pinnacle of military architecture in Stirland. Unfortunately, the defenses grew lax and thin over time, so when Conrad took over and attacked the fort, it fell in about 2 hours, as he simply leapt over the insurmountable moat and knocked the drawbridge down himself so his undead legion could just walk on in. Fort Oberstyre was repaired after Conrad fell, but this time the Count of Stirland spared no expense, and the garrison stood at 3,000 strong with 20 gun batteries guarding each crucial point with cannon and hellblaster fire. Unfortunately, this didn't seem to matter much when Manfred turned up and proceeded to take the fortress in a single night. He didn't even bother attacking it, but instead at sunset unleashed a horrific ritual that summoned hordes of ethereal spirits that simply floated through the walls and butchered the garrison. The only ones to survive were those who fled. So cursed is this keep after Manfred's foul magics that it remains saturated with restless spirits to this day, and all attempts to reclaim it for the Empire have failed miserably. The priests of Mor have been unable to exorcise the various ghosts, and such is their undying bitterness that entire garrisons attempting to man the fortress have committed suicide by throwing themselves over the ramparts rather than spend another night in its halls. Though I should note it was eventually purified by Volkmar the Grim, but this happened during the events of the End Times, or the prequel to the End Times. So for this settlement, I would recommend a unique structure called the Haunted Halls, or something along those lines. It should provide a notable penalty to leadership for those attacking the settlement, and should add a recruitment rank bonus to all ghost units like Cairn Wraiths and Hex Wraiths, as the spirits can be easily summoned from among those haunting the ruined fort. The final unique structure I want to go over for the vampire counts is actually in Athel Loren. So for those of you who have watched my Durthu Legendary Lord video, you'll know that he actually battled against Heinrich Himmler in a place of Athel Loren called the Hills of the Dead. So the Hills of the Dead are essentially a colossal burial mound where there are tons of corpses, which is why Himmler took the risk of attacking it. It would be nice, in my opinion, if we added that as a unique building in Arguelin. So perhaps if the vampire counts, which I think anybody can claim Athel Loren regions now, though if I remember right, they're hard to maintain control of because they're difficult to build on. In any event, it'd be nice if Himmler or the vampire counts in general had the option to build like the Cairns of the Dead or the Hills of the Dead as a unique structure, and essentially all I would have it do is just provide a colossal reduction in cost to the Raise Dead mechanic. I'm talking like minus 50 to 90%. Oh, I almost forgot. Just like with every Warhammer race, I believe the vampire counts should have a unique twist to their confederation mechanic, so here's an idea for them. I would suggest a significant bonus to confederate would be to own notably more territory than the faction you wish to confederate with, and be a higher power rank than them as well. Vampires respect power, but aren't prone to just outright challenging for leadership in open combat, like one might see with Norskins or Greenskins at times. It would be nice if instead we could enjoy some semblance of politics with the other vampire factions, but receive a large bonus to confederating with them if the player or AI faction in question owned significantly more regions and had a higher power rating, as you demonstrate that you're just a lot more powerful than them. In addition, I'd like more events or dilemmas for the player faction that could perhaps allow them to assist another vampire count faction at a price to themselves for a diplomacy increase, or be selfish and hog power to the detriment of the relationship. I know these kind of events did exist in vanilla Warhammer 1, but I'm not sure if they're functioning in Warhammer 2. They might still be functioning, but if they're not, A, we need to turn back on, and B, even if they are still functioning, there should be more of them, in my opinion, because the vampire counts are one of the few races that would actually have a lot of politics, from game 1 anyway. You know, really the Empire and the vampire counts are the true political masters from game 1. Obviously the dwarves do have quite a bit of politics, but theirs is a lot different and has much more to do with honor and fulfilling grudges and what kind of reputation you uphold, rather than actively bartering and trying to earn the affection of other factions like you would with the vampire counts and the Empire. The Empire more through trying to say we're, stronger if we stand together, whereas the vampire counts are probably more along the lines of I'm a lot bigger than you, so you can either die or get with the program. As a final aside, giving the Necromancer lords and heroes a skill to increase diplomacy with other VC factions by like +5 or +10 would be really nice, and make them a little more effective for campaign, which I'm always looking for ways to make those kinds of lords like the Necromancers just a little bit more interesting and better, just because especially with a faction where all the lords can use magic, it's kind of hard to make the Master Necromancer an attractive sell when you have a frickin' Vampire Lord or Strigoi Ghoul King as your alternative option. In any event, thank you all so much for joining me for the free LC section of the Future of Vampire Counts. I would love to see your ideas and your thoughts in the comment section below, and of course feel free to check the description to visit either my Patreon page or my Discord, where you can talk with me further there or just support the channel. I really appreciate either of those things. And if you really want to earn bonus points, I wouldn't mind if people cross-posted these to places they often visit, whether it's your favorite subreddit or forums or what have you. Thanks again so much for watching. We will be back again tomorrow at 7 a.m. to cover the Vampire Counts recommended DLC section, and I look forward to putting a cap on the Vampire Counts, at least for now. I think after we finish the Future of the Vampire Counts video, we might do a small video before the next complete Future of series, where we will essentially go over a lot of the major requests from the Empire and Dwarves and see which of them have been applied and which of them have not, and if those applications have worked well or not, because both of those factions have gone through some decent changes since I released those videos. Obviously, the Greenskins and the Vampire Counts are not going to be a relevant part of that discussion because there hasn't been any notable changes to their factions since I made these videos anyway. Alright then, that's going to do us for today. Have a wonderful day. See you tomorrow. Bye.